Hello, everyone. This is Rémy Miller. As I read through my books, I annotate them. I throw in a simple flag at the top of the page and write in the space of one sticky note my thoughts in order to be as simple and clear as to what I learned from what I just read, so that it's easier for me to write about it in the future, write it down, put it in my journal as something that would be prudent for me to hold on to going forward. And today we will be covering my annotations through the book Me, Myself, and Us, The Science of Personality and the Art of Well-Being by Brian Little. And you really get what it says on the tin when it comes to the title. So I don't think I have to do much more explication. It's a book about personality constructs, and how we view the self, in acknowledgement of the self, and how we view the self in acknowledgement of others. And it's a very revealing book. I have learned many lessons about myself just by seeing the information in here. And it's not only the information that it gives you directly, but also the things that has you think about are can be more impactful than simply the thought itself or the fact itself. So here, firstly, I have this sticky note starting right away on page 5 where I say, this is the reason why children misbehave, likely, because it's their attempt at experimentation to learn more about the world they know they're stuck in. View others' transgressions merely as learning attempts, however callous they may be. Because when people act in a way that you view as unsavory, it's not because they're doing something wrong necessarily, because you could be wrong in your perception of what's going on. So this is really about viewing the behavior of others as a manifestation of all of the influences and motivations of their personality. So each person should really be viewed like a machine in a way, in a stupid machine where they did this thing because of reasons X, Y, and Z. And when you try and understand those reasons and give a response to the situation or what someone said based on the information that's available as opposed to taking it personally, then you're going to have a lot better interactions with people. Because when you can understand somebody's situation as your own, suppose the shorthand for that would just be the word empathy. When you can have empathy, you can really begin to guide a situation in a way that would be mutually beneficial, instead of just reacting based off what you think is the right way to react. First blushes, as Brian Little says, is one of the most inferior ways to go about making predictions about people. So from the book, relevant to what my note says here, Kelly regarded each of these views as providing a far too passive view of the human condition. He proposed instead that each person is like a scientist, actively testing, confirming, and revising hypotheses about people, objects, and the events in their lives. Unquote. I didn't quote it, but there you go. Moving along from the book, quote, hostility from a personal construct perspective is the attempt to extort validation for a personal construct you already suspect has been disconfirmed. Consider a personal construct that you apply to yourself. You see yourself as dignified in contrast to those who, in your eyes, are pushovers. And he goes on, and what I thought here was when a person is angry, and it may be directed at you, it reflects an inner turmoil which they're attempting to resolve. This is somewhat in relation to the last point I was making. They must extract it by force from the object of their attention, so you must not permit this validation seeking to corrupt the both of you, because it ultimately will. If you are participating in the same behavior which you think is being detrimental to one or both of you, then you're equally as much of an offender in that situation. And it's very important to be wary about the raw data that's coming into your experience, because of course you can't change how you feel or what you think, but you can monitor your response to those elements, and you can learn from your response, the responses you have, and guide them in a way that you think is more favorable in the future. And so if you are in the same instant making a decision as having a feeling, then there's no delta between making the, by definition, least rational choice, because it's the most instantaneous, versus most rational. Now, sometimes that's not necessary. Sometimes you want the intuition. There are many times when you need to build into you this reflex of noticing something and then doing something about it right away, without any type of hesitation. Absolutely. Many times, especially if it's managing a relationship with another person, it doesn't matter who that person is. It doesn't matter what type of relationship you have with them. It's a matter of controlling your behavior in a way that is not going to inflame the situation. And corrupting is a good word there as well, because it wiggles its way in at the core and then punches its way up out, throughout your body, and then out of your mouth when you say something hostile or vulgar that you shouldn't have. Or maybe it manifests itself in passive aggressiveness, and you instead do something that's slightly hurtful to the person, though not directly, but is probably even more detrimental, because that means you're unwilling to let the other person know the problem as you see it. And when acting indirect in that nature, you're again causing corruption and spite and resentment and hostility in each other. Moving forward, he goes on later to talk about personality constructs and how we live our life based on these identities which we generate for ourselves. And he told this story about how he was teaching his class in university, and one assignment he had them all do is write down several personality constructs, which are some topic that has a binary element to it, right? So you could be honest or dishonest, hardworking, lazy, religious, not religious. And a lot of people come up with several of these. They'll have anywhere between 3 and 10, sometimes more. But there was one person in his class who came in, as he said, feeling like he marched into class every day, sat down at his desk with bolt upright posture the entire time. And when he was doing the assignment, he came up with one personality construct, which was in the army, not in the army. And then one day he had some incident where he had to get discharged from the army and instantly had a fierce anxiety attack and got institutionalized because of it. It was because his personality constructs, or rather construct because it was singular, was so rigid that any disruption caused total chaos. So my thought here was that having a few and rather loose personality constructs would be ideal in balancing the flexibility to reframe the descriptions which make up, in quotes, kind of who you are, in quotes, because those are both vague in terms of their intention of exactly what they mean. Because what is the makeup of someone? We don't walk around viewing each other as entire bodies. We walk around viewing each other as people that live in the brain, that the hand is different than the head for some reason. And so makeup is an interesting concept in this context, and so is, of course, who you are, because that involves the self. So too many constructs, too cumbersome, and too few, too rigid. So you don't want to have so few like this guy where one little thing goes wrong and you can't reconcile it at all. And you also don't want to have so overwhelmingly many constructs that when you need to adapt the exact description of your identity, you're not fumbling to find the right one that you should fall in. Because when you have so many, that ultimately means they have to be very specific so that they're each unique. And when you have so many definitions, it's like having a dictionary of 10 different languages in it, right? It's too much for what you need. You're only going to need a dictionary for one language. Now, moving forward, he's talking about the trait neuroticism, which is one of the big five, as they call it, of the personalities which are out there. So it's often abbreviated as, he puts in the book Canoe, I know it as Ocean, which is openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And talking about neuroticism here, which is really the capacity to feel negative emotion. So it could be anything from anxiety to happiness. I say negative emotion. It's really any emotion. It's how susceptible you are to changes in emotion. And one thing I was reading about recently, actually, is how the difference between more neurotic and less neurotic people influence their reasons for listening to music. So because people who are more neurotic, they have less emotional regulation and stability, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's both extremes are good and bad. But these people listen to music as a form of emotional matching. And so if they are happy, they will listen to happy music in order to match their mood. Whereas people low in neuroticism generally listen to music for a practical purpose of whatever that situation demands. Maybe you're doing some work and you want some more ambient or background sound. Or maybe you are exercising, so you want some high upbeat music. So it's more based on the situation than whatever your emotion is at the time. And I think that's very interesting. Similarly, people high in neuroticism listen to music to create the emotional state that they want to be in. So if they're sad and they want to be happy, they can play happy music, and that will alter their mood so that they then become happy. And so it's almost used as a tool as well, though not as actively in consciousness. And so when talking about neuroticism here, he mentions how it plays a very practical role in the grand scheme of evolution, because those who are more neurotic, who are more sensitive to changes in environment, they are going to be more alert to threats in the surrounding. So they can, so they're like the chihuahuas, the little dogs, the tiny dogs of the group, so to speak, that can't do anything in response, or maybe they can, but they are the ones making all the noise so that people know what's going on. And that happens with humans too. Humans, there are groups of people that bring up issues that lots of other people, even the majority, might say, calm down, there's nothing going on here. You're blowing this out of proportion. We don't need to make as much of a fuss about this. But that's not the point of them making all that noise on that topic. The point is to say, hey, something's going on here. It's almost like a fire alarm, so to speak. A fire alarm isn't going to say you have 30 seconds to live. It's not making any bold claims like that. It's just saying there's something going on here. There is some possible danger. This needs to be investigated. That's all a smoke alarm is saying. It's a simple machine. So we can look at what other people are saying And instead of dismissing it outright and completely, saying, okay, what is the one element here which we should be privy to? It's similar to how false positives and false negatives work in the environment, just as you're going through the world. Because a false negative is when you're walking in a forest on a path and you see a twig on the floor and see it as a twig and not react, as opposed to a snake. And then it is a snake and you're not prepared for it. That's a false negative. A false positive is when you're walking along this path and you see a twig, react as if it were a snake. And then if it's a twig, then so what? And so, of course, that allows you to be wary of what's going on and be ready just in case something goes wrong. But of course, that is going to lead to more stress. That's why people who are more neurotic, have higher trait neuroticism on average, don't live as long, because they're more stressed. They have more cortisol running through their bodies. Whereas other people who who detect more false negatives, they don't react to the twig that's actually a snake, of course, have less stress and live longer, but may incur more difficulty in their life because they're not detecting problems in anticipation of them, and so are further burdening themselves. Moving on here, one topic that interested me quite a bit is how he mentions substances that affect your behavior corollary to your personality, not necessarily exactly what that substance is about. So if you're doing something as innocuous as drinking a cup of coffee, it can affect your performance in more ways than just giving you some energy. Because if you have anxiety at the present moment, maybe it's situational, or maybe it's not situational. Maybe it's more of your personality to have anxiety. And you drink a cup of coffee, that will very likely make you less focused on the task at hand because your mind is running about the thoughts which are making you anxious. Whereas if you have more of a calm intent about your disposition at that moment, drinking a cup of coffee will bring you more focus in the task at hand. And I experienced this recently, in fact, where I had a variety of things going on in my life that I was dealing with, and I don't drink coffee that often, but I decided to grab a cup with someone else as we were both working on our own thing. And I noticed that I wasn't getting as much work done as I thought I was going to. Not simply because the other person was there and that acted as some type of distraction, but also because I found my mind running more, thinking about things other than the task I should be tending to. So not only is it influenced in your personality, like I said, but your present disposition and whatever you may have going on in life at that moment. I never thought about using substances in that way before and how it really reflects your mood. So the ultimate point there is to match your environment when you want to be productive or have a high degree of performance to your personality or disposition. For example, if you are very extroverted, you'll probably want to go to an area that has lots of energy and lots of things going on. Maybe a cafe would be really good for you, or a cafeteria of some sort, like a food hall in the mall. Maybe that's what you want. You need activity. You need that high octane environment to keep you focused because that matches who you are. Or perhaps you're very introverted and you prefer low energy situations. And so then it would be best for you, if you want to get stuff done, you need to be at home by yourself with noise canceling headphones on. Moving on here, in this segment of the book, Free Traits on Acting Out of Character, he speaks about what out of character really means and how our personality isn't as rigid as we need to think so. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that you are the way you are, and there's not much that can change that outside of traumatic events. But in fact, in each moment, we are a different person. If you're not aware of this fact, it's somewhat erroneous and misguiding anyway, but every several years, some say 7, some say 10, all the atoms in your body get replaced as a process of the cells dying and reviving and coming back to life, procreation, everything like that. It's not entirely true because there are some cells that stick around for the entire lifetime of your body, like your brain cells. Those stick around. I believe some liver cells as well, but I'm not sure. So it's not entirely true, but it's approximately true. It's true enough in the sense that you are different in every instant as the last. And so you can choose to be a different person or act a different way or think in a different manner. It goes back to the ship of Theseus, which has been postulated for ages now. And it's not a matter of, was it never the ship of Theseus? Is the fact that the ship of Theseus could be one entity, one definable constant entity, is completely frivolous in the first place? Or, it's the ship of Theseus the entire time, and it doesn't matter how many pieces of it change, it just matters how humans view that collection of items, even if it's the same collection of items or not the same collection of items. In this case, slats of wood and sail, bits of canvas or whatever they use for sail. So I think as opposed to those two, it's rather there is no such thing as a perception of that entity in the first place, in the sense that it is neither the ship of Theseus nor not the ship of Theseus. It simply is in the state that it is in. And I know that sounds like a roundabout excuse for a philosophical answer to that question, but I think it's true in the sense that our perception of whatever the object of our attention is influenced by what we think it is to be. And what we think it is to be is also variable. And so it is neither the object itself nor the perception of the object of attention itself which is constant. So if that's the case, why is there this concrete perception of it at all? And the same can be applied to your personality. We can choose to be a different person in each moment, and you should feel no fault for acting out of the ordinary or out of character if you're doing so to appeal to one of your core values in a way that's not manipulative, of course. So don't feel pressured to always feel and act the same. What people have come to expect of you doesn't need to be the way that you act. What you've come to expect of yourself doesn't need to be the way that you act. You can perpetually change the expectation of yourself. And by changing the expectation of yourself, you change the trajectory of the type of person that you will become one day. Presumably, you want to be a great person. You want to be a person of great achievement, however that is defined for you. And to do that, you need to see yourself as an entity capable of changing. It's like children. Children inherently respect adults because they know that we know more than they do. In a sense, children are humbler than adults because they know they have no clue what they're doing and they're trying to find their way through the world. So they are testing and experimenting. They're hitting the pots and pans together to see if that's an acceptable thing to do while you're watching your favorite show or reading your favorite book. So they're constantly trying to learn and trying to change and say, okay, this is the right thing to do. This is the wrong thing to do. Let me change my behavior. And so we need to have that childlike mentality even into adulthood, is having a monitor, not necessarily an ever-watching, omnipresent security guard keeping an eye on every single thing that you're doing, because you'll ultimately stress yourself out. That's when you cause yourself to be more neurotic. In a sense, though, it's to monitor your behavior and your reactions simply to be aware of them. This is to be mindful. This is to simply notice what is arising in consciousness. In this section of the book, moving forward, which he titles Mutable Selves, Personality and Situations, one topic he puts a lot of emphasis on is low versus high self-monitors. And one quick little test, which of course is not completely indicative of the type of person you are, but it's fun to do. So very quickly, on your forehead, use your finger and draw a capital letter Q. Now that you've done that, maybe you haven't. And as he says, if you haven't done that, you are very disagreeable, bless your heart. And if you did, in fact, draw a letter Q, how did you draw it? Did you draw the circle and draw the tail from the center of your forehead going towards your right eyebrow? Or did you draw it the other way as going towards your left eyebrow? Because that indicates whether you're high self-monitoring or low self-monitoring. If you're low self-monitoring, that means that you don't have much regard for your behavior in the present moment. You're not bothered by it. You're not constantly thinking about who you are and who and how you should be acting and how you should be thinking. You are the person that you are and relatively unchanging. Of course, there are extenuating circumstances and you can decide to do otherwise. By and large, that is how you are, because that is how you think you should be. It is a core value to you that being consistent in your persona is important for maintaining the relationships that you care about. Whereas if you're high self-monitoring, you are in pursuit of wanting to know as much information about a situation as you can so that you can alter your behavior to match the needs of what you're in. Maybe you're at a high-class dinner get-together. Maybe you are doing drugs with homeless people. Maybe you are doing any of the in-between. And you want to know what's going on, how are other people acting, what do they expect of a person in this situation? How can I, and that doesn't necessarily mean you conform. That just means you want to be aware. And so if you draw the cue with the going from the center out to your left, that means that you think about how others look at you because you were drawing them as if they were to read it, and it would be the right way round when another person is looking at your forehead and reading it. Whereas low self-monitoring, more internally based, you're concerned about how you see it, and so you draw it so that it makes sense to you. I think that's a fascinating concept. Moving on here, this next one is tricky because here he refers to personality possibly being a skill. This was a very surprising concept to me because I thought of personality so deeply as a structure which is largely permanent throughout your life, that after your critical period, which is from approximately ages 3 to 7, your personality is going to be set. And then following that, you have a little bit of wiggle room and learning experience by the time you turn 25, because that's when your prefrontal cortex fully develops and your reasoning has been set. How you reason, the modes and vehicles you use to think about the world in a rational way. And so because I had this idea, which I thought was so much founded in what we understand as the truth in psychology, this really challenged it. So he refers to personality as possibly being a skill, because if personality is simply acting the right way in the right circumstance, maybe that's not personality. Maybe personality is simply a conglomeration of influences and experiences you've had in the past. And so you don't have much guiding force over it, but that is the way that you are, and that is your personality. But it doesn't necessarily have to be, because people act in different ways, people have different personalities. And if you choose, you can look at someone else and say, I like how this person acts. I like how they think about the world. I want to be more like that person. That's what an idol is. That's why people look up to others. And so if you can change, which many people have, that means it's something you can get better at. And that's simply what a skill is. It's something that you practice, you improve, you get better at. And so if high self-monitors are people who look at the information of the situation and change their behavior and their speech to some degree, of course not wildly, based on what's going on, are they more skilled in personality? Are they more skilled at using personality? I think it's an interesting concept, and I think it's in fact true, because the self is no stable thing at all. No thing is no stable thing, in the sense that, like I said earlier about the ship of Theseus, that the constitution of the object of your attention is not stable or secure, and the constitution of what your thoughts are not stable or secure. In this way, it is possible to have an inferior use of personality. I think that's something to think about, because if there is some component of yourself with which you're unhappy or you're dissatisfied, you don't have to lament that and accept that that is the case and that it will forever be the case. You can accept that it is the case and make a decision about what to do to not have that be the case going forward. The extreme of being way too high in self-monitoring would be aesthetic character disorder, which is exactly that you are so concerned about what other people are thinking and judging and evaluating that there is no you behind the behaviors that this person is, that all you are is a reflection of your surroundings and the people that you know. And that of course is bad, because it's interesting in how he describes high versus low self-monitors, and how lows are like avocados and highs are like onions. Whereas with low, that there's all this kind of mushiness and ambiguity around the outside, that there's all this flesh. But then once you get down to the core, it is this hard stone that is not changing, right? Whereas with people who are high in self-monitoring, it's the opposite. It's an onion where you get all of this depth and layering, and you keep getting closer to the center with all these layers, but there's nothing actually substantial in the middle. It just layers out into non-existence. So very fascinating concept there, and very good use of food as analogy. I usually think they fall apart when people try to come up with those, but here I love Brian Little's writing, because I'm someone, I reckon, who's very particular in the books that I choose to read and what writing styles I tolerate. And the kind of I'm relatable, I'm jovial writing style is not favorable to me at all. I really don't like it. It seems like, to me, the author is putting on airs to try and seem cool so that the average reader can get along with it. But it ultimately sounds hackneyed and force-fed. I really don't like it. But what I like about Brian Little's writing is that it is the perfect amount of that, as well as simply informative. And he describes ideas with such simplicity that anyone can understand, which I think is a sign of great writing, as opposed to a sign of writing which is not great enough. So then this concept of how personality can change over time is subject to erosion and toxification over time, because there are these personality assessments out there, these personality tests. Of course, the major ones are the Myers-Briggs test, which can say that there are only 16 and rather pleasant types of people in the world. And you have the Big Five test, of course, which there are short versions are online. But really, if you want a true personality test, you have to get an assessment, whether that is the TAT, whether you go in. I mean, when it comes to assessing your personality, the only way to do it is professionally And the only way to do it professionally is by having redundancies. You take multiple tests. You'll take a depression inventory, the TAT, the WAIS, your average and your common intelligence test, what we think of as your IQ test. And all of these things together inform what type of person you are, right? The Rorschach is a common one. You can't assess a person's personality only on the Rorschach or only on the WAIS IQ test. And so that's a problem that people have, is they can come to define themselves in such rigid ways as to prohibit their growth. And that's ultimately what is the worst offense of all, is preventing yourself from being the great that you can be. That's why this idea of self-esteem is not necessarily erroneous, but misplaced, because we should be thinking about the next moment as to not stall ourselves in the present. That is not to say don't be mindful of the present. It is absolutely necessary to be tethered to the present moment and nothing else, because that is ultimately what defines your satisfaction, in the sense that you are living a life that is meaningful to you. Because change comes in the form of either the external or the internal. So that means when change is happening in our life, it's easy to prevent ourselves from wanting to change and saying, I am the person that I am. I'll deal with this problem the way that it is. So when lots of things are changing in your life, you want to say, I'm going to persevere through this no matter what, in a way that's persistent with what I viewed myself as in the past. But that is, of course, how you stall change the most. And the opposite is true. When we are changing a lot through life, perhaps we're going through a lot emotionally or intellectually, creatively, we want things to be relatively stable in our lives. That change is zero sum. So when one side is affected in one direction, the other is affected in the opposite direction, in the inverse direction. But perhaps they should be changing in both directions at the same time. So when there's a lot of change going on in your life, you should be more open to change and make active efforts to change more often. Because just as the great Miyamoto Musashi said, the truth is as it is, and you either bend to it or live a lie. So when reality as you know it is not behaving the way in which you expect it, that means it's time to change what you understand yourself to be, not what you understand your situation to be. And in this way, you will become a person of more diverse adaptability. And problems cease to become problems in the typical sense. They become more obstacles that need to be traversed or resolved, rather than this huge complication that's going to add stress. So about 3/8 through this book here, in the area control, agency, and the shape of a life, he mentions the very famous test, the Marshmallow Test, that is often given to children, although I suppose it could work on adults, given the right subject participant. I've read about this many times before, but I've never thought about it in this way. And I think that is the case is because of all of the preceding information I've read in this book up to this point. It allowed me to reframe how I understood something I knew about before. And so I'm grateful to have information with which I'm already familiar be repackaged in such a way that can enrich my life once again. So this Marshmallow Test, if you're unfamiliar, is you sit a kid down in a room, you put a marshmallow on a plate and say, I'll be back. And the person leaves the room, they're there alone. What this kid does ultimately determines how much impulse control they have. This is called delay of gratification, because you tell the kid, I'm going to leave the room, and when I come back, you'll get to have two, okay? So you see if this kid can say, okay, can I wait? And it's not determined. You don't give them a specific amount of time because you allow that tension to build of, I don't know how long I'm going to have to wait, but you know what? I don't need this right now. And so it'll be better if I just wait anyway and I get another one in the future. But if they don't think that and they eat it right away, or they wait 30 seconds and eat it, or wait a long time and then eat it, that tells you about who this child is in a way. And you can also see what their behavior is by monitoring how they react to it if they don't eat it. Because some kids they'll say, okay, I understand. The researcher or the parent leaves the room, and then they just turn away from it. They completely disregard it, say, you know what, I'm not even going to acknowledge its existence as to not be tempted by it. Other kids, they'll look at it, maybe they'll touch it, maybe they'll bend down, they'll smell it first, and then they'll wait the whole time, or maybe they'll do that and then eat it later. So it's a very simple test which can tell you a lot about it. And ultimately, I think what one should be doing if you see this test administered to your kid and they don't have that impulse control and don't have that delay of gratification, it's time for some behavior correction. It's time to start gently guiding them in the right direction, because that is ultimately a person that is not going to act in their best interest. They're going to act in ways which seem to make sense to them at the time, but aren't better for their future. And the most happy and successful children, however you would like to describe those terms on whatever axes, are the ones which can acknowledge the present, but hold out on present desires for the sake of future payoff. And that happens in the sort of every category. Later on here, he's talking about control. And this is a concept that I enjoy thinking about very often because, what is control relative to the human experience? It's a rather bizarre and elusive and mysterious construct. And my idea here is somewhat based in an evolutionary perspective, how every creature has evolved to do that which contributes to survival. Contemporary conveniences have loosened what's necessary to survive, so it is those whom do, especially if the activity holds personal meaning, which have the least disturbed lives. So the pursuit that you decide to invest your most time and energy, it better be a meaningful one. Because if it's not, you are draining yourself of the fluids which you need to survive. And you're dehydrating your spirit of what you need to move forward. And because we are meant to do and do as a means to survive, that means what you're doing must relate to how you think you must survive, how you must think you live. And that's not an easy concept to fathom or even come to a conclusion to on what it means to do something which holds meaning to you. And it's the same in the inverse direction, to have meaning in the thing that you're doing, because that implies the opposite sense of scale. The first is a macro, where you do what has meaning to you. But then when you instill and hold and harbor meaning in every which thing that you do, that means that you're being conscious, you're being aware of how your current behavior is affecting yourself and others in the present moment, as well as what the implications are for the future. And you can use this concept to really ground yourself. You can think to yourself, even in the super far future. Think about yourself on your deathbed and see your behavior now. What are you doing in your life? Think about the past hour of what you've been doing, the past day, the past 10 years. And how is it that you've been spending your time? And what have you been worrying about? And what haven't you been worrying about? If you were to think back on your life, on your deathbed, and say that you were a successful person, what does that mean to you? What does it actually mean to be successful? in your eyes. Maybe you want to make lots of money, and it's as simple as that. But that's likely not the case. There is another meaning there. Maybe you want to make money because you care so much about the flourishment of others that you want to give. So you become an incredibly successful businessman or investor, and you just give lots of your money away and live in a studio apartment. Maybe it's to make sure a loved one with a disability still has a happy life and you care for them. Maybe you're on the front lines of battle, and what brings you meaning is making sure the guy right next to you or the woman right next to you is receiving as much of your effort and love as you can muster. It doesn't matter what that life task is for you. It matters how it relates to the corest of your values. One very interesting nuance here is that he talks about this study in which they went to this old person's home and had university students meeting up with them and just generally trying to make their lives a bit better, giving them visits. And the residents at the home, some of them could control when their visits were, could control the time of the day, time of the week when this university student would visit, maybe bring them some tea and biscuits and have a chat with them. And the other group did not. They did not have any control. They just popped in whenever they did, and that was that. What they found is that the residents who could control their visits had much more contentment and happiness. There was, of course, as you would presume, because they had more control, there was less chaos to interrupt with the order. And generally, when there's more order, there's more peace in our lives. And generally, when there's more peace, there's more prosperity. So that's why we want that. However, this study ended. Everyone packed up their bags, went home. And then they returned years later. And what they found is that consistently, the residents that had more control over the routines had higher mortality rates, higher anxiety, less general satisfaction and happiness, because what happened is that they had a button, and this applies to every person. They had a button that they could press. They wanted something out of the world. They knew what to do to make it so, and then had immediate interaction and satisfaction and fulfillment of what it is they set out to do. So they have this button of, I want to visit it this time. I can press the button and it'll be there. And then what separating this for some great amount of time did was remove that button. That button is no longer hooked up. It's no longer connected to anything. And so when something that was reliable becomes no longer reliable, that means that everything else that was based off of is going to fall into disarray. You know, that was the core pillar that everything was leaning against. That disappears, and then the whole structure implodes and collapses in on itself. And so the funny idea there is that control makes you happier and healthier, but only if you can control it. It's true in the sense that anything can be true because nothing is permanent. So when you base your expectations on something which you want to be permanent but is not, you will ultimately be thrown off the raft, so to speak, when the tide comes too high. And that relates perfectly back earlier to the personality constructs at the beginning. Because when you have something that is so unchanging that any disruption is a major one, your life is going to be full of turbulence. And so you must be willing to move as all else moves around you. So then, stress is variable insofar as the individual is able to suppress or reframe it. So stress is not constant, but until changed, your perception of it is. I kind of had this realization recently, which was the most simple thing, but I really liked how I reframed this because it's a skill, just like all others. Reframing is a skill that I've been practicing a lot more of recently. And the more you do it, the quicker it comes in the moments when you need it. That's how practice works. I had changed my sleep schedule and I was not facing very much success with it. And I was thinking, is my why not strong enough? Because we all, at least, should have a why which gets us out of bed every morning. If you're not getting out of bed every morning at the time that you want, in the way that you want, then your why isn't strong enough. And so this thought was troubling me, that I'm rather convinced that I have the right why, but I'm still having that trouble. And so what I thought to do was, instead of charging my phone at the end of the day, keeping my alarm on and charging my phone in my bed at the end of the day, charging it before I get to bed and placing it on my bookshelf so that when it goes off, I can choose to really sleep through it if I want to, or just get up and deal with it. And of course, that made the world of difference, the simplest change. And so I was able to reframe and not feel bad about myself because it's, oh my God, I have to resort to these cheats, to these hacks in order to just get out of bed every morning. But the second after I announced that to myself, I thought, no, it's not that. It is that my why is in fact so strong, not so weak, as to encourage in me to use every stratagem, even the smallest one, to ensure that I'm fulfilling that why every single day of my life. And there is no reason why you can't think of it in that second way. That first way has no use for you. It's deadwood. Let it drift off. Because these negative reinforcements for your behavior are only acting to prevent yourself from acting in the way that you want to in the future. So just as I was saying earlier, as mentioned in the book, don't have your view of yourself be permanent. This will only bring about cognitive dissonance for you. You cannot have a perception of permanence in the reality of impermanence. I used a different colored sticky flag here to denote how significant this page was for me. It's about 3/4 way through the book, in Personality and Creativity, the Myth of the Solo Hero. This chapter about creativity was it mapped onto myself so literally that it all came to a head in the last paragraph. And so I'll read it here. He says, quote, "Finally, it is important to realize that well-being has many different facets, and these facets may be in conflict. Your pursuit of creative ventures might bring inordinate satisfaction. It might become the defining cause of your life. It might change the world, but it might extract a toll on your health or relationships. So in the end, it comes down to making choices about which of these various aspects of the good you accord the greatest significance. Follow your passion, by all means, but know that in doing so, you might be choosing your poison as well." And I said here on my sticky, past Rémy cried reading this paragraph. It personally addresses perfectly the challenges I face. Following my pursuits as liberally as I would like means I must actively consider how I'm managing my relationships. It does indeed extract its toll. And I think about this often because I've noticed myself over time going more from an extroverted tending personality to an introverted tending personality. And I have a greater interest and focus on my personal projects because I believe that my personal projects harbor so much meaning and I harbor so much meaning for them that it would be a violation of my duty as a person in this world to not pursue them. So I'm very selective with what I choose to do so that I can maximize the meaning that I have in this world. The way he describes that dichotomy of creativity right there is wonderful. It describes me well. I'm sure it describes a lot of other people out there well. And it has the biggest effect in context of the entire chapter. So one thing you must keep in mind, even as I'm talking about this book and the lessons that I've learned from it, is that there's no substitute for reading this. And that is the case with every single book that I will talk about, because there are lessons that one can learn, but the lessons one learns are different per person. Mileage may vary, but those miles are going to be worth it. Moving on here and talking about where are you, personality and place. He mentions Milgram, Stanley Milgram. I learned about him in AP psychology in high school, advanced placement psychology. It is one of the most basic things that you learn. It's one of the, you probably learn about this day one, Stanley Milgram and his experiments. What he ultimately came to understand from monitoring behavior in the way that he did is that there is a converging effect of all of the factors in your life, which can lead to an information input overload, as he says. This overload suggests to you and inspires you to seek stimulation-reducing strategies, as Brian Little phrases it in the book. Stimulation-reducing strategies with the attempt of slowing down the pace of the stimulation. And so this made me think about, for some reason, maybe it was the word stimulation or stimulation-reducing strategies, which made me think about drug use and how rehabilitation centers then use this strategy of slowing down the pace of life for the patients because they use the drugs in the first place in order to make their moment-to-moment experiences move less quickly. Now, I am about as least qualified as one can imagine to talk about drug use and the purpose of rehabilitation centers. So perhaps my idea could be entirely naive, but this makes sense to me that when there is either so much complexity in your inner life or so much complexity in your outer life that you want a way to not be directly and straightforwardly confronted with the complexities of that at that moment. So you use a drug in order to skirt that. Maybe you want to slow down your perception so you have more time to think about it. Maybe you just want to slow down your experience in general to put off thinking about it. And so at its core, it's not about an avoidant behavior. It's about a pace reducing strategy. And so what rehabilitation centers do is they become so boring that there is nothing else for the patient to do except match their pace of their thinking with their own life. And so rehabilitation centers are not much about drugs. It's not much about removing the drugs as it is providing an environment in which there is a reduced pace. I'm unsure of the veracity of that statement, but it makes intuitive sense to me when you think about it as a base principle. Moving forward in the book, but back a point here in his chapter about personality projects, the happiness of pursuit. I made a note here talking about how your society also influences the pursuits which you deem valuable to have. Your personal projects describe you only as much as your society allows them to. So individualism and the pursuit of personal projects are going to be more common in societies which emphasize the righteousness in doing so. And so in cultures that favor independence of character more, you're going to see people that have personal projects more often and ones that are more personal that may not directly benefit other people, because that's something that's valued, right? So in the opposite case, in collectivist cultures, they're going to disincentivize personal projects, because who are you to do something which is personally fulfilling and personally meaningful when there is this entire community or a country which needs your contribution in order to not fall into famine, disease, disruption, chaos, and riot. And so when you have those differing attitudes, not only is it going to affect your decision to embark in a personal project, but also what those personal projects are specifically. Now, this next one here in the same chapter is a bit of a controversial one here. And I'm curious about this idea more so than I do believe it. I want to make that clear because he talks about the difference between how men generally choose to pursue their personal projects versus women. Women generally, in participating in some project, make it public. They turn to a community because they want the support of other people and they want feedback as to what's going on, and they want to talk about others' personal projects. And so there's this community around it where they want support to know that what they're doing is good and it makes them happy, and it's what they should be doing in their life in order to have a solid sense of well-being. Whereas the men generally do the opposite. They want to be left alone with their ideas. They don't want the scrutiny of the outside world. They want to have their own program. So then it's very interesting because is it then the case that men have been consistently great innovators throughout history because women in their personal projects choose to go public and receive support, thereby rendering their ideas to be those only socially accepted, whereas men seek solitude and are more able to break the norm. And I'm interested in this idea because does this speak about an inherent way in which men and women differ? You know, there are lots of ways. You know, men have more muscle mass than women. That's a basic physical fact that 99% of people are going to accept. There are a few out there that contest that point. And the differences in women are as true physically as they are mentally. Men and women are largely the same, but there's some disparity. For example, when it comes to intellectual ability and capacity, men and women are largely the same, but the bend, the curve that you see between men and women is that men occupy the higher range of intellect, but also the lower range. So men are more often a lot smarter, and women are, and also a lot stupider. There's a lot more cases of mental disability as well as genius, essentially. Whereas women still can have geniuses and they still can have mentally challenged people of great mental disability, but it's not going to be as often, right? So do those two things have a relationship where, because men do that, come out with great achievements a lot of the time? Of course, women come out with great achievements just as women can be geniuses as much as men. This also implies the question, is it something about men versus women, or is it something about that pursuit in general? Is it something about seeking solitude and not having much of a relationship to the outside world in order to come to the epitome of the idea? I have no clue what this necessarily implies, but it makes me think that it's something about the solitude. Of course, there's no such thing, like he says, as a solo hero. They all have support by one person or by many people. For example, you can take two ends of the extreme. You can take Charles Darwin, who, of course, revolutionized the world with his ideas. And although still suffering from a crippling illness that no one really understood at the time, and really only to several years ago did we really understand what's going on, he had the support of his wife, which did everything for him. You know, played him piano during the day so that he could be nice and relaxed, kept people away from the house so they wouldn't distract him. And she was pivotal in ensuring that his ideas were coming to fruition. He could not have done it without her. Opposite end of the spectrum in terms of a period of time and scope amount of people involved is Steve Jobs, where he has great ideas for revolutionizing how we interact with technology, but you know what? He's got a boatload of people working for him, and all of those people are necessary, down to the secretary and janitorial staff, to upper management and the executives. And wrapping it up here on the topic of personal projects, what comes first when it comes to how you understand the organization of your life when it comes to personal projects? Are you doing them to keep your life together, or are you keeping your life together by doing them? Right? So does failure to commit to a core personal project mean that all other peripheral projects fall apart? If it does, should it? And if it is, can we prevent it from doing so? Is it the case that if your personal project, which is the why for your existence and non-existence and reason for continuing, if that project for some reason falls apart, does that mean everything else is going to fall apart? Because that is the central column that is keeping everything together. Is this the structural member that is necessary to the integrity of the whole? Or is it the opposite? Is it the case that the combination of everything going on in your life is supporting you pursuing this personal project, right? If you stop pursuing this personal project, is it necessarily going to mean that there is no more meaning in your life? Or does that mean that your meaning isn't necessarily tied to your project? Because this goes with the personality constructs of earlier, where if you are no longer able to pursue this project, does that mean there's no reason to exist anymore? No. That means that you need to change your project. And so your personal project is not the manifestation of what you think the thing you should be doing is. And this goes both ways. So when evaluating your recent and not so recent behavior and thoughts and reactions, reflexes, and you're unsatisfied with them, and you think that they are bringing about a life that is not meaningful and does not bring meaning to others' lives, then that means that there's something you can do to change it. You are not defined by your projects, whatever they are. It could be a project that you are voluntarily participating in, like getting better at violin, or it could be entirely involuntary, like dealing with the leftovers of other people's problems that you have to clean up. So it's entirely possible for both to be the case. And it's a matter of identifying which are which are projects that are your own and which are projects that are not. You don't need to only have projects that are your own, and the same goes for the other side. So that is all I have for Me, Myself, and Us, The Science of Personality and the Art of Well-Being by Brian Little. It's a book that had been on my to-be-read list for quite some time, probably about a year and a half, and finally snagged it and really enjoyed it because personality books are very interesting to me. I love learning more about myself and others. And if you want to know why the way you are and why you don't have to be the way that you are, go ahead and read this book. I really suggest using it as a vehicle for understanding yourself in a more profound way. Because ultimately, you are the only person which you will know your entire life. And so if you don't get to know him or her, you're ultimately sabotaging that person in the present and in the future. You will not bring about the full realization of what the best things you think are for you. So keep this in mind while reading this book and any other book, and more next time. Farewell. So you see if this kid can say, okay, can I wait? And it's not determined. You don't give them a specific amount of time.